Yes, I'm going to talk about this program, Ikaarvik, Barriers to Bridges. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about sort of how it came about and what it is and what we do, and who's doing it, and some of the things that we've learned along the way, the great lessons, the positive things, the challenges, and so on. So I'm just going to start. I think everybody in this room is pretty familiar with, I mean, I saw how many hands went up about visiting Nunavut. I think people in this room are pretty familiar with the idea that the Arctic is changing and that it's changing rapidly, that in many ways it's changing faster than many other places on the planet. And so it's sort of in that context that a lot of this is happening. And in particular, it's people, and since we have Pond Inlet folks here, I thought I'd show some friends. That's Darlene there on the left, and Randy in the middle, and that's Pond Inlet, where these folks are from, on the right. It's people in the north that are greatly affected by this change that's going on. It's not just the polar bears. It's the people who live in the north and who are impacted on a daily basis, who are on the front lines of climate change and who are experiencing changes in sea ice and changes in permafrost and in wildlife and so on. So with that in mind, there's a real race right now that's going on to try and understand these changes, to try and understand what's happening, try and understand the nature of the Arctic in the first place, and how things are changing and how things are going to continue to change. And that race is not just a scientific race. It is certainly, there's since you'd probably know this better than me, but since like the 1400s, Europeans have been bouncing up to the Arctic perhaps, but it's really 1700s when any real science started happening, probably. Something like that?
Yeah, even into the 19th,
Yeah. So science in the north is a pretty young activity. At the same time, there are many, many generations of researchers who have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, who have been making predictions and testing those predictions and taking measurements and observing, and really in a lot of ways you could say that Inuit are the original Arctic scientists. And so there is, in the north then, there's a scientific way of looking at questions and trying to understand things, and there's another way of knowing and describing and understanding the world that is more, you might call it indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge. It's often called Inuit Hayumayatuqangit, or IQ, which is this combination of Inuit traditional knowledge and customs and values kind of all packaged into one. And so I wanted to lay that context because we'll talk a fair bit about these two different ways of knowing and describing and understanding the world, and how this project called Ikaarvik is trying to sort of reconcile those two things in some interesting ways. But now I'm going to go back about 10 years. So I work for the organization OceanWise. It's a nonprofit, runs the Vancouver Aquarium and various other initiatives, research activities, quite a lot of research in the Arctic and elsewhere, as well as education programs, camps, clubs, all kinds of things and exhibits and so on that talk about the Arctic. And let's see, there it is. So about 10 years ago, as the Vancouver Aquarium, we recognized that we needed to really increase the amount to which we were engaging people, particularly in the South, about the Arctic and the Arctic dialogue. We realized that we needed to increase the extent of our Arctic-related research. We realized that there were people in the North that we needed to connect with more than we were in order to do that, because really these aren't our stories to tell. These are the stories of the people who are living and experiencing the Arctic. And we knew we had a certain toolbox. We had tools in our toolbox. We have, an exhibit that talks about the Arctic, and about 1 million people a year come through the front doors, so we can reach a lot of people, but what we say then really matters. And the question is, well, what do we talk about? What is the important dialogue to have with people in the South about the Arctic? We knew that we had a large research program. We knew that we had education programs and camps and clubs and other youth programs. So we had this toolbox, but we weren't sure what to build when it came to working with and about the Arctic. So I started working full-time as director of Arctic programs about that time. And the first thing that I did was travel north and spent about a year and a half just visiting communities. And generally I'd walk into a community that had never met me before, and you know, I'd sort of show up and I'd hear, so, are you with Greenpeace? I'd say, no, and forgive me if you're with one of these organizations. Are you with PETA? No. Polar Bears International? No. WWF? No. Then what do you want? I'd sort of go, well, great question. I'm not really sure. What do you want? It was a way to start a conversation to understand, you know, we've got these tools. We don't know what to build. We don't know how we can make the best contribution that we can make, whether it's Arctic research or the Arctic dialogue with Southern Canadians or whatever it might be. And so I ate a lot of dried fish. And by the way, once you've drum danced in front of elders who are taking pictures, you know you've pretty much gone about as low as you can go. But had a lot of conversations. And then at one point, I was in Pond Inlet, and this was my first trip to Pond Inlet, and I ran into that person over there on the left you might recognize, Shelley, and this group of amazing young folks that she was working with. Shelley was teaching the environmental technology program in Pond Inlet. It was the first time it had been offered in Pond Inlet, and the intention of the program is really to train people to be research assistants, field assistants, that kind of thing, technicians, that sort of thing. And this great group of young people, it turned out it just happened to be all guys, but it's not always that way, but it just happened to be all guys in this case. These guys were also attending meetings about the Baffinland mine, consultations. They were interacting with researchers in various ways, and they felt very strongly that they weren't being engaged the way they probably should be in terms of interacting with researchers, working with development like the mine and so forth, that there was a need for more meaningful engagement and direct involvement in conversations and discussions. At the same time, the idea that the research agendas, when these researchers come up to the north, the agendas are generally set in the south. The methodologies are generally set in the south. The research questions are generally set in the south. Even what's considered ethical when working with northern communities is determined in the south. And so they felt very strongly that there needed to be more effective engagement and involvement by northern communities, and they wanted to see that happen one way or another. They also wanted to find a way to help Southern Canadians better understand the North from northern perspectives. And so that's something that certainly the Vancouver Aquarium had the opportunity to do. We reach lots and lots of people every year. So what we realized is there may be some ways to work together. And Shelley had asked, you know, look, you guys are involved in research. You have lots of research connections and you're doing research yourselves. You have exhibits where you talk about the Arctic and Arctic issues to millions of people. You have education programs, youth programs, and various kinds of things like that. So is there anything that we could perhaps do together to help address some of the concerns that these folks had? And didn't take long to sort of say, yeah, I think there is. So our first line of thinking was, well, these guys have a lot to say. What we need to do is bring them south And we did. We created the Southern Expedition. Because, you know, everybody from the South, when they go to the North, they go on an expedition, you know. It's like, these people live there. You're going on an expedition, they live there.
We actually made, like, and these guys had to make their own jackets, and we got as many patches as we could from different funders. And we put them on, and we're like,
Yeah. Because everybody who goes to the North has a patch, you know. So you gotta. So it was awesome. But they came down and spent about a week at the Vancouver Aquarium, not in some kind of, which is valuable, but not as a cultural exchange necessarily, but actually as consultants to help our organization, to work with our staff, our volunteers, our board, to help our organization better understand the North from Northern perspectives. So they worked with our education staff, our interpretation staff, our content producers, the ones who create videos and things like that, our volunteers, everybody, as mentors in a way to help our organization better understand the North from Northern perspectives. They also got training from our interpretive staff on public communication and then spent time working in teams out in the galleries, talking to the public about their home and their lives, in really kind of a two-way mentorship where, you know, our staff would have the public communication skills and things, and these folks would have the knowledge and the experience, and by working together, they're teaching each other at the same time they're teaching the public. They gave presentations. It was a tremendously valuable experience for us and our organization. And then we all went to Ottawa, and we met with, at the time, the Canadian Polar Commission, now Polar Knowledge Canada, Parks Canada, Fisheries and Oceans, at a relatively high level, actually. And these folks sat down and expected to hear from this group of folks from Pond Inlet. Well, to be honest, I'm not sure what they expected to hear, but what they actually heard was a lot of perspective regarding how research is conducted in the North, how research is communicated back to the communities. They basically said, you know, look, these are the things that we need and that we don't feel like we're getting. And it was a really great experience for those that were in the room as well. Then we went to Laval, which is the base for a lot of the research that goes on Violet Island, for example, which is the front door of Pond Inlet. And there had been research going on Violet Island for many years, but very infrequently did anyone spend any time in the community or communicate what was going on back to the community. And so they had wonderful, frank conversations with all of these graduate students and researchers saying, you know, why don't you ever come to our community and tell us what's going on? And they,
remember, Eric, the most important point was we went there, they know this was a whole organized thing, and there was no space on the agenda for our group to speak.
yeah, that's true.
We didn't realize you had something.
You had something to say, yeah. So it turned out, though, that in this conversation, you know, why don't you ever come to our community? What they heard was also really surprising to them, which was, we didn't know we were welcome, and we didn't know you'd be interested. And so they started this whole great conversation and relationships that have continued now for several years after that. So it was a very effective trip, for sure, the Southern Expedition, and I mentioned the value for our organization. It really helped shift the way we framed our dialogue with the public. So, for example, we began in all of our programming and exhibits and other things to start to talk more directly about the logistical and economic issues associated with getting good nutrition in the North, as well as the social and cultural importance, all connected to the importance of hunting in the North, for example. And then decided to put up the nutritional breakdown of beluga, muktuk, and meat next to this discussion about the nutritional, the difficulties of getting good nutrition in the North, next to swimming belugas. And people in our field, other people at other institutions said, you're going to do what? You're going to talk about what? I mean, that's almost as if you're condoning hunting. And we said, well, yeah, it's because we kind of are. I mean, it's it's free-range, organic, naturally harvested, locally sourced, sustainable, nutritionally important, culturally, socially. I mean, duh. Of course we're going to, but you have to understand that even just 10 years ago for an organization like ours, that was really going out on a limb. And we actually expected that we'd get people angry and, but it doesn't work that way. I think people get it. But so it did have a big impact on us. Then in 2013 came the Arctic Inspiration Prize. And the Arctic Inspiration Prize is awarded based on your past experiences as well as a proposal for what you would do with the money if you were to win. And we had proposed that we take what we learned and create another southern expedition, but do a number of other things as well. And we called this new program Ikaarvik. And Ikaarvik means bridge. And so we did this second expedition, and the Inspiration Prize allowed us to bring folks from Gjoa Haven and Cambridge Bay and Pond Inlet. One of the things that the folks from Pond really wanted to do in creating a new program was find opportunities for mentors from the north to mentor other folks from the north, and they wanted to have that opportunity and to be able to do that. So we brought down mentors who had participated in the last southern expedition along with these folks from these other communities. And that was great. We spent time at the aquarium, but we also had them work with the Assiniboine Park Zoo, with the Toronto Zoo, with the Edmonton Science Center, all of whom do a lot of communication about the Arctic to public audiences, and another trip to Ottawa and so on. But we did some new things too that turned out to be really important. We did some ways of knowing workshops. So we had with public audiences welcome to have these conversations about two ways of knowing and understanding and describing the world, and to get more of the perspective from these northern folks about their life in the north. But we also did these workshops just while we were on the road in the hotel. Just those of us who were traveling together would do some workshops. And we started to do things like explore the strengths of Inuit Qajumajatuqangit, IQ, and the strengths of science as two different but potentially compatible ways of knowing and describing and understanding the world. And exploring, now it's not me and Shelley who are doing that. Our job really is to just facilitate the dialogue and conversation. I'm not the person to talk about the strengths of IQ. That's not my place. But to have these dialogues, and also to have dialogue about the relationships between research and communities. Historically, what it's been like, as well as what these folks would like to see it become. And these workshops, it turned out, were some of the most important things that came out of doing this southern expedition. It was certainly valuable to engage with all these organizations and so on, but it was really these discussions that we really started to seize on as being really important. And this idea that the focus should be on growing the capacity for Inuit to have more self-determination regarding research and more meaningful engagement in it, and finding ways to make that happen. And we realized that we could probably have more impact on that if we do these workshops in the communities rather than bring folks from various places down south and travel around. And it's partly logistically, but also just the ability to reach more people. I'll also point out one of the other things that we learned in this process. We brought down youth, but we also brought down some folks from sort of this middle generation, sort of this lost generation in some ways, because there's lots of programs that focus on elders and youth. There are very few opportunities, though, for the generation in between to engage meaningfully in these kinds of conversations. And we found that generation in between was a really important, an important bridge between the youth and the elders in a number of different ways. And they became important mentors as well. So that was an important lesson for us in that process too. So at the same time, you have the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement. You have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, all of which are calling for more meaningful engagement of Indigenous people in research. And more recently, the Inuit Tapiriit Kanadami Inuit Strategy on Research as well. And that and the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement also specifically call for more, in fact, the Land Claims Agreement specifically says equal consideration of IQ and science in research in Nunavut. The problem is there isn't anything that really says how you do that. So how do you incorporate Indigenous knowledge and customs and values into scientific research? We know the communities are looking for that. We know nationally, even internationally, there's a call for that. But how do you do that is an interesting and difficult question. Another piece of context is this one, that 60% of Nunavut is under the age of 30. Young people in Nunavut and across the North really are not just sitting around waiting to inherit the planet. They are an extremely important part of it right now, and they're being asked more and more to take more leadership roles. And they're looking for those kinds of leadership roles. You've got awesome people like these three, for example, who, when given an opportunity to take a leadership role, dive on it. And so we recognized that we probably had something working with youth, and that was an important thing to be doing. And that these workshops had been working well for us. So what we decided to do is shift a little bit and focus on these workshops. And in particular, the way these things work is youth will identify the strengths of IQ, Indigenous knowledge, the strengths of science. They will think about how each of them brings something to the table when you're trying to understand issues that are important locally to a community. There are certain things that Indigenous knowledge can do that science can't do. And there are certain things that scientific research can do that Indigenous knowledge can't provide. And so they spend a fair bit of time thinking about those things. Because once you've done that, it's a lot easier to start to think about how they can work together. They then identify issues that they feel are important for their community, that a research project that uses both IQ and science could potentially address. And while that says environmental issues, the reality is, as many of you probably know, you can't separate the environment from the social and cultural and political and economic contexts that it exists in, especially in the North. Thank you, Ina. And so if you're talking about, well, we're concerned where all the caribou went, that's not just a wildlife issue. That's a food security issue. It's a social and cultural sustainability issue. And so while it says environmental, the reality is these are all connected. So they would identify what these issues are for their community that they think could become research priorities. Then they have the daunting task of presenting that to the rest of their community.
So back here, when you switch it, they're like, oh, that was so scary. Presenting to elders.
Yeah. So they'll present to elders, to members of the Hunters and Trappers organization, to the Hamlet Council, and so on, to say, well, this is the stuff we've been thinking about. These are the issues that we've identified as important. And they'll get feedback from the community, and the community will add to that list and comment on that list in a way to sort of develop a type of a consensus on what could be research priorities for that community. It is a scary thing for a young person in one of these communities to stand up in front of a bunch of elders and say, well, this is what I think. It's not generally how it works. But it's a tremendously powerful opportunity as well, and we've found the support for these young folks in the community is tremendous when they do that.
People observed too that this was the first time there had ever been a meeting hosted by the younger generation. The first time a meeting about research had ever happened without other researchers in the room, where the community had the freedom to just talk and create.
Yes, thank you. So here's an example of a list of issues. I'm focusing a lot on Pond Inlet just because in honor of our guests. Yes. But you notice that the list ranges across the board. And the youth did a pretty good job when you think about the number of things that were added there by others in the community. A next step, by the way, in this is to take it from something like shipping to saying, how do we turn that into a question that we could research or try and understand better. And so these would all get turned into questions. What about shipping is the issue or the concern, for example. So the next step then.
Oh, sorry, could you go back just 1 second? Just because I think it's really important that the majority of these will not show up on anyone else's agenda. And I think when you look at an example like having the airport in the community with carcinogenic de-icing fluids that aren't contained, it's only going to be the community that could identify that and prioritize that. This isn't on anybody else's agenda. So a lot of these things I think are really interesting in just what it does to science in the Arctic as a whole to allow people to identify things that are important that aren't showing up on anybody else's agenda.
Yeah, so we'll do workshops at Student Day at the ArcticNet conference, for example, and ask, what people think, what graduate students think are the big research priorities for the Arctic. But we'll also have in the room about 50% of them Northerners, and we'll ask the same question. And of course, you very different answers about what those research priorities are. So the next step then is to connect the youth and their community with researchers, not just who have a certain expertise, but who have the right kind of mindset to want to work with youth and their communities as partners to address one or more of those research priorities. That means they need to be a person who's willing to come into a community with a certain level of humility and to say, yeah, I'm here to sort of help and to consult, but these are your issues, this is your agenda, you're in charge. And then the youth are trained to work with that researcher and others in their community, maybe hunters or elders or hunters and trappers organization, whatever it might be, to actually be involved in all aspects of the research, starting with co-developing the research questions, the methodology. If there's interviews to do, who should be interviewed? If there's data to be collected in the field, the youth will be out collecting the data in the field. But they really, in many ways, they develop a sense of ownership over this research project. And I'm still searching for the right word, but with regards to the researcher, they'll put their arm around that researcher and say, all right, don't worry, we got you covered here. We know you want to ask this question of our elders, but if you ask that way, you're totally going to get an answer that is not what you're looking for. So let's fix that for you, And in addition to simple things like what time's the co-op close, but the important things, they're right there. And they participate in all aspects of the research. They communicate back to the community. So they'll go on the radio and talk about the work that they're doing. Importantly, not just at the end, but throughout the process. They'll go to the co-op and they'll set up a table and they'll sit there and talk to people as they come in about the research that they're involved in and why it's important for the community and things like that. So they're an important part all the way through. And so that's kind of how the model works. What I'd like to do is just show you some examples of some of the projects that youth in different communities have been involved in, and to give you a little more of a sense. But just to sort of summarize that, really these youth become a bridge between the research and their communities. And we find that to be a really powerful thing. The youth and their communities are empowered then to identify and act on research priorities that they determine, as opposed to that are determined in the South. And at the same time, they're getting a whole bunch of transferable skills and experience and self-confidence that allows them to become leaders in their communities as well. So it's a good formula we're finding. So we'll start with the pond inlet example again because one of the issues that you might have noticed on the list in pond inlet was invasive species. So there's a mine not far from pond inlet, the Baffinland Mary River mine. There are ships. Bingo. And there are ships that travel almost on a daily basis now to that mine, and they pass right in front of pond inlet on the way. So there is a concern from the community that those ships in their ballast water or on their hulls may potentially bring invasive species to the area. And so for this project, we connected the youth with Kim Howland from Fisheries and Oceans. She's the research mentor on this project. Kim has been very interested in the issue of invasive species in the Arctic for some time and has been working on developing methods to look for different species in the water using environmental DNA. So the idea is that anything that's swimming around or crawling around in the water is shedding its DNA all the time into the water. And so if you collect that water and you filter out the DNA that's in it, you can actually identify what species have been crawling or swimming around in it. And it's really pretty cool. So these youth then learned about the issues of invasive species, learned how to conduct sampling. That's, I think, Sylvia, they're kneeling down over there, and Andrew behind her. They're collecting samples in the wintertime there. And they, over a 4-month period, collected samples each month, filtered them, processed them, then sent them to Laval to be analyzed for DNA, identified 241 species, just using environmental DNA in the water. The good news is none of them at the time were known to be invasive species, which is great. But it set up a kind of a baseline and the training that's necessary to develop a long-term monitoring program for the community, which is what they're very interested in. Another one that comes up a lot when we do these priority setting workshops is increased in ship traffic. So the Arctic's becoming more accessible, there's more ships coming into the region, whether they're resupply ships or tourist-related ships or resource extraction-related ships, whatever they might be. And so in 3 communities where that was identified, Salluit, Gjoa Haven, and Pond Inlet, we worked together with Jackie Dawson from the University of Ottawa and her team, Natalie Carter and Jennifer Provencher, to train the youth on participatory research methodologies, to be able to conduct interviews, do mapping exercises, to ask these communities, and when I say in this case ask these communities, I mean people who are actively out on the land, mostly hunting, but also doing other things out on the land, what kind of impacts there might be on people and on wildlife if ships were to come in at a certain time or place around the area. And this is important because the Coast Guard and Transport Canada have proposed shipping corridors where ships should travel in the Arctic. And this is an opportunity for these communities to say, if ships were to travel in this, along this corridor at this time in this place, that could have an impact on seal denning, or where the polar bears are, or where travel routes might be if they're breaking ice and we need to get from one place to another, this kind of thing. And so the youth in these communities then have contributed to this process. Each community has got a report back, and that report goes to Transport Canada and the Coast Guard to inform their process of developing these corridors. In Kugluktuk, the biggest issue that came up in Kugluktuk was the health of the Coppermine River. Really important river for the community for a whole bunch of reasons. And the community basically said, we're concerned about the health of the river. We connected with a researcher named Christina Brown first, and we did a second workshop with youth in the community to say, okay, concerned about the Coppermine River and the health of the river. What does that mean? What does a healthy river look like? What kinds of things have you been observing over time that have you concerned about the river? These kinds of questions to help develop essentially a list of parameters that could be monitored over time. And then we connected up with Heidi Swanson and Rosie Smith from University of Waterloo, both river scientists, Arctic river scientists, to actually work with the youth and the local hunters and trappers organization to develop a monitoring program. They were trained to set up and deploy all kinds of sensors and loggers and time-lapse cameras and all kinds of things. And this summer deployed all those things out on the river, and as part of a 3-year project. At the end of those 3 years of monitoring the river, they own the equipment. They've got all the training. They have everything they need to continue that monitoring program for as long as they would like. And that's really ideally the way this should work. Is the community identifies the issue, the community is involved in determining what the research protocols and methodologies and so on ought to be, together with somebody who may have some experience in that sort of thing, like Heidi and Rosie, for example, and they conduct the work. They own the stuff, they own the knowledge, the skills, the experience, and they continue on with that. The last one, we'll go back to Pond Inlet, as well as Arctic Bay. Sorry, you got to share this one with Arctic Bay. Sorry, dudes.
I'll share it.
Okay, thank you, Ina. So it's probably safe to say that most of the communities that in the Arctic are concerned about changes in sea ice, if not all the communities, really. The sea ice is getting thinner, it's getting less predictable, it's getting more dangerous to travel on, and it is incredibly important as a way of traveling, as a way of doing your hunting and so on. And so the concerns about sea ice certainly came up in places like Pond Inlet, Arctic Bay, Gjoa Haven, various other locations. And this project, the research mentor is Trevor Bell from Memorial University. And Trevor had developed, together with some other folks, particularly in Nain, Northern Labrador, a way to map and measure and monitor sea ice conditions over time. And so working with youth in the community, the youth conducted a workshop with others in their community to ask, what are the sea ice related issues, concerns, questions that our community has that should perhaps be monitored and measured and mapped over time? And what kind of information do we need to get as a community to feel that we can travel more safely on the ice? And what came from that is SmartICE, and it's Andrew Ariak there on the left is the sort of regional manager now of SmartICE. He's also an Ikaarvik mentor, and he goes out. He has this thing called a smart komatik. Komatik is the sled you pull behind your snow machine, and it's basically like a ground penetrating radar kind of device on the back of this komatik that can actually measure the thickness of the ice and tell you a little bit about the status of the ice as well. And he goes out finds out from the community, where people are concerned about right now. He goes out, crosses it, cruises along it, comes back, and as soon as he's within Wi-Fi distance, basically, it downloads all the data, creates a map, and the community has the information they need to be able to be more safe on the ice. So it's a great program, and it's now won the Arctic Inspiration Prize last year, and is now a larger social enterprise project. So, yeah. So, it's really easy to give a talk like this and make it sound like everything is perfect. It's not. We've been learning as we go. There are several challenges. This is just a few of them. Money, of course, is always a challenge in everything we do, but in particular, it's difficult because the academic research machine is not structured to be able to fund people to go up to a community and find out what their concerns are before you actually start your research. If you want to get funded, you've got to come to that funding organization with your research questions, with your methodology, with your protocols, how you're going to analyze it, how you're going to interpret it. All these things need to be in place before you can even get funded. Well, that doesn't match very well if the goal is to spend time in a community to understand what the needs of the community are before you start your research. So we've had to work kind of hard to find interesting alternate sources of funding, whether it's through foundations or other kinds of things, to be able to fund that kind of thing, to fund these kinds of research priority workshops and so on. Capacity, whether it's in the communities or within Ikaarvik itself, is certainly an issue when it comes to proposal writing and things like that. You're lucky to get a 10th grade English writing abilities out of high school in Nunavut, let alone be able to write proposals and things like that. So there's a capacity issue, and we work as much as we can closely with the communities to help develop these proposals for this kind of work. And within Ikaarvik, we have mentors in various locations, and we have Shelley, and we have me, and we have lots of great young folks. But the reality is there's only a certain number of us, and being able to continue to grow and so on is difficult. It's also, you do some of these workshops and people get really excited, really energetic, engaged, excited about this kind of stuff. And then you want to keep that level of excitement going. So you've done that project. What's next for that community? How do we keep the youth engaged and involved? Is always something we're thinking about. What's the next project? What's the next thing that we can bring to Gjoa Haven, for example, whatever it might be? Another one is changing leadership in the communities. We work a lot with the Hamlet Council or the Hunters and Trappers organization, and the leadership in these communities changes quite often. It's really important when working with these communities that we build relationships that are lasting, long-term relationships. And when, the manager of the Hunters and Trappers organization isn't there anymore, and that's your relationship, well, that doesn't work so well. In fact, it's one of the great reasons for working with youth, because the manager of the Hunter Trappers organization, the Hamlet Council, those people come and go, but youth just get older, They stay in the community and they get older, and we build those relationships over time. And that's a really valuable thing. So there's a certain level of youth professional and personal development, and there's meaningful employment as well that comes out of this. These youth get paid to do this stuff. We want them to understand that we value, that their skills, experience, and knowledge are valued. And so that's important. The personal and professional development that provides young people the confidence and courage to go do things that they might not do otherwise, for example. Decolonization of research, a big one. We didn't set out to decolonize research. That wasn't our goal. But we're finding that it does happen that way, and that's a powerful impact. Importantly, shifting the dynamic from who gets to set the research priorities is also an important impact, I think, and saying research priorities can be set in the north as well as in the south. It doesn't mean that no research should be developed in the south and run in the Arctic, but it does shift that balance. And then ultimately better incorporation of IQ, Inuit knowledge, into science as well. The last piece I'll talk about before I end up is one of the reasons that these folks are here, in addition to working with Kent on issues of ethics and research in communities, is we're all headed to Cambridge Bay. We're bringing Ikaarvik youth from 4 communities, from Kugluktuk, Gjoa, Cambridge Bay, and Pond Inlet, all to Cambridge Bay for a summit. And they've been, as I said, focusing on these issues of Inuit knowledge and science and the relationships between research and communities. They're going to expand on that. They're going to develop a framework, write it up, with recommendations on how Indigenous knowledge, and particularly these 8 IQ principles, can inform the relationship between research and communities. Because Inuit Kayumaya Tukangi, IQ is, it's more than a body of knowledge. It's also about relationships. And so they're asking the question next week, what does it have to say? What do these IQ societal values have to say about relationships that may inform how researchers and communities can work better together? They're going to write it up. They're going to publish it. We're just going to help facilitate the process. And so it's really exciting, and we're really looking forward to that. So in conclusion, again, the bottom line is that Indigenous communities have frequently been the subject of research, but less frequently have been able to sort of own the agenda more and drive that research. Youth can be a very effective bridge between research and their communities. They have a foot in both ways of knowing. And, you know, Shelley has said in the past, and I've seen it too, that youth sometimes see that as a disadvantage, that somehow they're less Inuk if they, you know, are sort of also have a foot in a Western science way of knowing and describing and understanding the world. And in reality, it's a huge advantage. It's an awesome opportunity. And so taking advantage of that is important. And then again, as I said, we didn't set out to address the issue of reconciliation, but we really have come to realize the importance of decolonizing science as a form of reconciliation. So many aspects of research, scientific research in the North and elsewhere, have a sort of colonial history and are in need of revisiting how we do them, how we do this research, and how that relates to the needs of Indigenous communities around Canada and beyond. So with that, I will leave it there. I'll say thank you very much. We went over a little bit. I apologize, but I had no idea that it was going to be 15 minutes of stuff before. So, but I love you guys. So thank you.